Yeah, I think this is on. Great. Good evening, everyone. So good to see such a nice turnout for this event. I am so pleased to be chairing this panel this evening, which features the work of my friend and colleague, Dr. Bashir Mobasher. In particular, his recent book, Constitutional Law and the Politics of Ethnic Accommodation, Institutional Design in Afghanistan. I'm Mimi Kirk, Associate Director and Adjunct Faculty in the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. I'm going to first introduce Dr. Mobasher and our other panelists, Dr. Benjamin Hopkins and Dr. Mirwais Balki. And following Dr. Mobasher's talk, around 15 or 20 minutes, they will provide commentary and ask a few questions. I'll then perhaps add a question or two of my own, and then I want to open things up to you in the audience. So first, welcome Dr. Bashir Mobasher. He teaches in the American University Department of Sociology, the New York University Department of Political Science, and the American University of Afghanistan Departments of Law and Political Science. Dr. Mobasher is the current president of the Afghanistan Law and Political Science Association in exile. He's an expert in comparative constitutional law, identity politics, and human rights. He's authored, reviewed, and supervised numerous research projects on constitutional law, electoral systems, and identity politics. His recent research projects are centered around decentralization, social justice, and Orientalism. Dr. Mobasher obtained his bachelor's from the School of Law and Political Science at Kabul University and his LLM and PhD from the University of Washington School of Law. So joining Dr. Mobasher are our discussants, Dr. Benjamin Hopkins, and as I said, Dr. Mirwais Balki. Dr. Hopkins is Professor of History and International Affairs and Senior Associate Dean of Academic Affairs in the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He specializes in Afghanistan and British imperialism on the Indian subcontinent and has authored, co-authored, and co-edited numerous books on the region. And he is online, so glad you can be with us, Dr. Hopkins, and I hope you're feeling better. He's home, as I know you're recovering from a cold, but we're so glad you're able to be with us. And last but not least is Dr. Mirwais Balki. He's Public Policy Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where he's working on a project titled The Social Thinking of the Taliban. Dr. Balki is former Afghan Minister of Education. Okay, so Dr. Mobasher, you have the floor.
All right, can you hear me? Awesome. All right, so thank you, Mimi, and thank you, panelists, Dr. Balki and Dr. Benjamin. As you know, he's got cold, but he's still with us to criticize my books. So I wish you a speedy recovery, and I wish you to take it easy on me this time. One of the most challenging constitutional questions for most constitutional law scholars, political scientists, political sociologists, but also scholars of different other disciplines is why some constitutions succeed in state building and nation building and other constitutions fail. And looking at the literature, we know that there is no one answer because different scholars tend to offer different theories and they disagree with each other on what and when we can get the right constitution to do nation build and state build. And to further muddy the water, I've tried to answer the same question in my book, Constitutional Law and the Politics of Ethnic Accommodation. And the question specifically that I'm trying to answer in this book is, in what ways the Constitution has failed ethnic accommodation in Afghanistan? And to answer this particular question, the first thing I did, which is in the introduction of the book, was to conceptualize what ethnic accommodation is, what ethnic accommodation constitutes. And I'll also discuss in the introduction to what extent Afghanistan has been successful in terms of ethnic accommodation, Constitution of 2004. So I'm talking about the Republican era, which starts in 2021, in 2001 until 2021. And then I will talk about constitutional design in Afghanistan and its relation to the failure of ethnic accommodation in Afghanistan. I particularly talked about in the book I discussed a number of political institutions that were basically set up by the framers of the Afghan Constitution of 2004 and the subsequent laws. And those institutions included the presidential system, the checks and balances, electoral systems for presidential election and parliamentary elections, and centralization of power, and a very strong unitary system, as well as a number of laws and regulations, including constitutional provisions with regard to political parties of Afghanistan. And then I will have a concluding remark. So can you go to the next slide, please? Okay. So what do I mean when I say ethnic accommodation? The literature seems to offer different kind of understanding of what ethnic accommodation is. For some, it's only a representation. For others, it's about distributive justice and equity. For others, it's still a method of self-governance or an approach to self-governance for ethnic minorities. Can you go next? For me, it includes all of that. It does include a matter of inclusion, which comes in the form of power sharing and representation. It does come of equity and distributive justice, especially inclusive laws and policies, important decisions with regard to various communities. And it does include the issue of self-governance. And the last one, which may be particular for the case of Afghanistan and may be different for a different country, is the institutionalization of cross-ethnic coalitions. Because based on the political culture in Afghanistan, ethnic parties are not preferable political organizations. People would rather have cross-ethnic or non-ethnic political parties rather than ethnic-based political parties. And that's why the political parties in Afghanistan were never popular. So that's the fourth element. Now, in order to achieve a full ethnic accommodation, you need to meet all of these criteria, all these features of ethnic accommodation. You cannot reduce ethnic tensions, and you cannot get full accommodation if you miss one and then achieve the other. So you have to meet all of them. Now, what the constitutional design has to do with all this? Can you go to the next slide, please? Well, before all that, let me examine to what extent the Afghanistan has been successful or failed in terms of inclusion, institutionalization of cross-ethnic coalitions, self-governance, and equity. So in terms of power sharing, what I did was basically I looked at the population of different ethnic groups in Afghanistan, and I compared that with their representation in the government and in the parliament of Afghanistan. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we do not, unfortunately, have a census of different ethnic groups. What we have is estimates of different groups. And if you look at different sources tend to give you different estimates of different demographics, and that's the problem. But I relied on the estimates that were used by the United Nations, World Bank, and have particularly been used during the elections in Afghanistan. So based on that, those sources between 2001 and 2016, Pashtuns make between 38 to 44% of the population. Tajiks make between 25 to 27% to 92%. Uzbeks between 6 to 9%. Smaller groups, and there are many of them, combined make between 7 to 15% of the population. Unfortunately, you cannot see it because it's indeed Zoom. And now if you compare it with the average seat shares in the government across 4 administrations and in the assembly across 3 parliament assemblies in Afghanistan, you can see that at least for the large ethnic groups, their population is reflected in their representations in the cabinets of Afghanistan, as well as in the parliament. except for the smaller groups, which have only 3% seat shares in the cabinet. In the parliament, they're okay. In the cabinet, there's a problem. They got the short end of the stick. And in fact, if you look at their seat shares or representations across 4 administrations, you can see that they started with 7% of the seats in the cabinet, and then they ended up with 0% of the seats in the last administration. So there was a big problem there, particularly for smaller groups, not necessarily for larger groups. Can you go next? So the issue of self-governance, I looked at 2 things. First, are the bodies and local governments or local administrations elected or their officials are appointed by the central government? That's first. The second thing, what constitutional authorities they have, right, to measure their self-governance. Can you go next? Based on the Constitution, we had 5 elected institutions, right? But actually, we only had 2 elections for provincial council. That was it. And they have no constitutional authorities at all. In fact, they didn't have even administrative authority. And their authority or decision-making power was limited to advising the governor. And who was the governor? The governor, who was the most important officer in a local government, was appointed by the central government. And the most problematic aspect of it was that these governors were mostly from outside the provinces that they were governed. Sometimes linguistically, culturally, ethnically, and religiously, they were different from the local population. So they didn't know the population, the communities, and the communities didn't know their governors, and we had a survey about that. And therefore, there was a big gap between the two, and they could not provide the services they needed to provide to accommodate the needs of the local communities. And the other problem, I can explain it perhaps later, was they didn't have a lot of loyalties towards the local communities. And in fact, when the Taliban started advancing across different provinces, most of these governors, without a single shot, they just surrendered the province and fled the country or fled the province altogether. And instead, it was the local militia who picked up guns, built their defenses, and started fragmented resistance against the Taliban's onslaught. Can you go next, please? Thank you. The issues of inclusive laws and policies. So I didn't look at all laws and policies in Afghanistan. There were many of them. I only looked at those decisions and policies and laws where different ethnic groups had different needs, different wants, and different demands. And I wanted to know when the law was made or approved or ratified, or when a decision was made, did it accommodate everyone's needs or it favored some groups' positions and needs over other groups? So there were 21 of them. Can you go next, please? And if you look at the percentage of the favorability of these laws and decisions, you can see that the laws and decisions favor Pashtuns the largest, 73% of the time. And these laws and decisions favored Tajiks, Hazaras, and Uzbeks 22 to 20% of the times. And then small 66.7%. And there were 3 of those disputes. So the laws, at least for the largest groups, was not necessarily equitable or just or fair. Can we go to the next, please? And most Afghans know what laws I'm talking about. For example, higher education law, ID card law, the issues of power line, and things like that. And for the institutionalization of cross-ethnic coalitions, I was looking at whether some coalitions of cross-ethnic nature emerged during the elections, before the elections or after the elections, or not. Can you go next? We see a high number of cross-ethnic coalitions emerging in presidential elections, but not necessarily in parliamentary elections. There was one multi-ethnic coalition that did emerge in parliamentary elections, but it dissolved even before, right after the election. But when we are talking about the institutionalization of cross-ethnic coalitions, we are not just talking about the emergence of these coalitions or their forging, but we are talking about these coalitions surviving and competing in the next election and the next election and the next election as an opposition and as an incumbent coalition. Unfortunately, that was not happening. A lot of cross-ethnic coalitions were happening, but then they were dissolved. They would dissolve right after the election or a couple of months and years later. So every new presidential elections, we have new set of cross-ethnic coalitions. Can you go next, please? Next. So what constitutional design has to do with all this? There is, as I said, a lot of theories, and I have to suffice with a couple of them. The most prominent theories of constitutional design in divided societies, one is called consolidationalism, and the other one is centripetalism. I'm sure some of you are familiar with these theories of constitutional design. Overall, their argument is that for divided societies, you need a set of political institutions so that you can accommodate the demands and needs of different communities. For constitutionalism, this should include a parliamentary government, proportional representation for the elections, grand coalition of in the government, and a veto power for the minorities on the issues that relate to their identity and culture, and segmental federalism or ethnic-based federalism and decentralization. Well, for centripetalism, they prescribe, or at least they are not against a presidential system, plus a ranked choice electoral system, and instead of a proportional representation, a non-segmental federalism or decentralization. So that's their theory. I agree with them. When we are talking about constitutional design, we cannot just focus on one institution, for example, only on the electoral system. We have to study that system or that institution in relation to all other institutions who may have an impact on ethnic accommodation. What I do not necessarily agree is to propose a set of institutions for all divided societies. My argument is that divided societies are not all the same. Something that may work for one divided society may not work for a different divided society. So what's my proposal? Can you go next, please? Next, please. Okay. My proposal is contextualization of institutions matter. First, the second argument I make is that you need an inter-institutional alignment or congruence for ethnic accommodation to happen. What do I mean by that? You cannot accommodate different ethnic groups if you have one set of institutions that promotes it and encourages it and advances ethnic accommodation, and then you have a different set of institutions that discourages ethnic accommodation. So there has to be a congruence between these institutions. Remember I talked about cross-ethnic coalitions, why we had a lot of them in presidential elections and not many in the parliamentary elections? It was because of the electoral systems, because they were not in alignment with each other. The 50% threshold of winning under the presidential electoral systems encouraged cross-ethnic coalitions because no ethnic group alone could deliver that 50% vote. And therefore, the candidates have to reach out to different communities and form a broader coalitions. Whereas under a SNTV system in parliamentary elections, there was no threshold. And in fact, we had candidates who won with 2% of the seats, or even with less than 2% of the votes a Congress seat. So that was the problem. Because if you can win with less than 1% or less than 2% of the entire votes a seat in the parliament, you didn't need to form a coalition. In fact, coalition would be, but that does not make sense because it's costly. And that's why we didn't have any form of coalitions. In fact, the political parties that we had usually would fragment during the parliamentary election in the same way that they did in the presidential election. The second argument I make is that you not only need inter-institutional congruence and alignment, you need intra-institutional congruence and alignment, which is each institution, as I put it here, is a complex set of sub-institutions, and each one of which may have different kind of influence on various aspects of ethnic accommodation. The green lights are positive, the dark lines are negative. So, so you not only need inter-institutional alignment, you need intra-institutional alignments as well. Let me give you an example. We had some sort of checks and balance, or I would say rather lack thereof, under the Constitution. For example, the president needed the approval of the parliament for his cabinet appointees. And that's why you could see, at least for the large groups, more kind of proportional representation of different groups in the cabinet. But the president usually used a lot of loopholes within the Constitution to bypass the parliament when it comes to the issues of making laws, policies, and those important decisions. And that's why the laws were not inclusive. The laws favored one ethnic group or some ethnic groups over other ethnic groups. ID card law was one of those. Higher education law was one of those. So even some of the laws that the parliament could not ratify and pass because different ethnic groups were really, their demands were not accommodated in those laws, the president would jump in, would issue the law under a presidential decree, and that law would favor one ethnic group over others. And that was the second problem in case of Afghanistan. And the third argument I make is that you can do institutional fine-tuning. And by institutional fine-tuning, I mean that you can actually tweak some of those parts of the same political institution and make it work for ethnic accommodation. And we actually did it under the Constitution of 2004. Initially, the framers decided that we have to have one vice president, which is normal in most presidential systems. But then they decided, no, let's have two vice presidents. And actually, two vice presidents made the presidential teams more inclusive because the president was from one community and the vice presidents were from two other communities. And in fact, in some elections, presidents would go further and create this de facto vice president position so that they have a third ethnic group in their coalitions as well. And that's how they created broader coalitions, not necessarily to form an inclusive government, but to gain more votes from various communities. Can you go next? So I call this approach a jigsaw puzzle approach. Why did I call it a jigsaw puzzle approach? Because like in a jigsaw puzzle, you need all the pieces to fit together and fall in the right places. Only then you can get a full picture. Otherwise, you can't get it. In a society, you need all these institutions and sub-institutions aligning with each other. Only you get ethnic accommodation. Remember, the pictures may differ for different countries. The size of the puzzle may differ for different countries. The shape and the size of those pieces may differ for different countries. But what doesn't change is that they have to align with each other. And that's the main argument I make for my paper. Hopefully, it's generalizable more than Afghanistan. So I'm going to end here, and I'm looking forward to hearing our panelists and hearing you as well. So thank you all for your attendance.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mubashir. That was fascinating. Yeah, just a really concise, well done presentation of your argument. Dr. Balke, would you like to speak first and give some comments and reactions, and then we can turn to Dr. Hopkins? I'm the boss. I'm the moderator, so I will give you the mic because I don't. Are you mic'd actually, or yeah, you need the mic.
Well, thank you very much, Mimi. Good evening, everyone. I thank John Bredema Center for inviting me to this book talk. And I congratulate for Dr. Mubashir, the author of the book, Constitutional Law and the Politics of Ethnic Accommodation, who has been a great friend of mine and also a great young asset for the academia, especially for Afghanistan. I'm pretty sure that we will be witnessing many more book discussions for his upcoming writings. He's a prolific writer and thinker for this generation. Uh, what attracted me the most when I was reading the book was the institutional design in Afghanistan. Because what Dr. Mubashir showed at the end of his slide was the Jaxa puzzle. I believe as a student of nation state building, especially in Afghanistan, that far in the history, in the political history of state building in Afghanistan, either we have tried a lot to fix the contested broken puzzles, piece of a broken puzzle, or series of hypotheses which cannot be tested on the ground in Afghanistan. The overall literature, if you review in Afghanistan, we have done one of these two efforts to build the state of Afghanistan, to build the nation of Afghanistan. But the institutional design of the country has been taken for granted so far in Afghanistan because the series of the hypotheses that we have, we always focused on Afghanistan through the ethnic perspective, through the power politics perspective, through the intervention perspective, and sometimes through the traditional way of state building in Afghanistan. But we never focused whether the institution that we have in Afghanistan since the formation of modern Afghanistan in the 1880s suits the modern Afghanistan. Can the institution deliver services to the people of Afghanistan? Can the politicians and leaders in Afghanistan have the real ground authority from the people of Afghanistan? These questions which are not responded in the political history of our nation statehood in the country. So that has been one of the crucial topics. Dr. Mubashir has focused on that and he has written in the book. What I believe is that what he designed in the book is fortunately with a series of merits and strengths for us in Afghanistan. He is, or the book is one of the few literature which is produced in Afghanistan, which gives the readers an in-depth of a legal perspective and a social contract perspective for the nation builder designers of Afghanistan, whether the local designers, whether the international designers who are focusing as an Afghanistanologist, what Dr. Mubashir focused in his book and termed also, he is one of the advocate of the term Afghanistanologist. So that is why I believe if we dance around the merits of the book, it gives us that strength, that literature, that understanding of the ground realities of Afghanistan through this book. For example, if I go for some of the strength and merits of the book, first of all, what it brought to my attention was the method Dr. Mubashir used in this book, which was based on evidences and surveys. You have, you have seen some of the diagrams, some of the surveys that he personally has conducted in Afghanistan, maybe in the earlier years, but these are so much important when you talk about a fragile state like Afghanistan. because majority of the literature, bulk of the literature is focused on abstract knowledges or some of the qualitative understanding of the society, maybe in a top-down approach or bottom-up approach. But what this book has given us as a literature is many evidences. You can see from different localities of Afghanistan, from different parts of Afghanistan, different geographical packages of Afghanistan, what the people demand, what have been on the ground in the, especially during the Republic era in the past 20 years from 2001 to 2021. One merit that I found in this book, which is so much important. The second merit, what I have seen in the book was that the book itself is totally cover to cover statement of the problem in Afghanistan. It has an identification approach of the ground conflicts in Afghanistan, which again, I believe that's so much important for us because we know that if we cannot identify the major variable of the conflicts and fragility in a country, you cannot respond with the solution. First of all, you have to understand what exactly is the major source of the conflict in the society. This book has given all the statements of that problem on the ground. First of all, when I was reading the book, in the initial chapter, Dr. Mubashir has given a small title called Identifying the Problem. And I was a little bit afraid that Dr. Mubashir, as usual, like all ad authors, all Afghanistan he is also concising to 1 and 2 pages of stating the problem in Afghanistan. But when I was reading ahead, I saw that no, he has kept this method throughout the book. That is why in the next chapters also, if you see the content of the chapter, you can see, for example, a chapter called a centralized government in a decentralized society. That is stating the problem because maybe one of the major sources of the conflict throughout the history of modern Afghanistan is that we have installed a centralized authority in a country which significantly and naturally it is decentralized, maybe based on the topography of the country. Or for example, he has written another chapter which is called a failed nation or a failed constitution. That is also so much important because we have not so much concerned about the social contract of the people of Afghanistan. Whether we have socially contracted a well-mannered contraction for ourselves, among ourselves, the contract based on the traditional image stocks that we have in our political history has imposed us to define specific behaviors, specific understanding of each other, and then imposing the design of the authority from Kabul to all different parts of the country. So that is also, I believe, one of the most important merit that I found in the book. Then what Dr. Mubashir has done in this book is that he has casted and developed certain terms and terminologies which is useful for Afghanistan only. As he himself was presenting just now, he said, I'm stating that one piece of a jigsaw puzzle maybe is not suitable in another. Each country, I'm a student of regional studies. For me, each country is a region itself. Each region has specific parameters for understanding. That is why you cannot universalize the literature of nation state building from one country to another country. You have to go indigenization process so that based on the culture, based on the thinking, based on the behavior, based on the memory of the people, you have to find the terms, terminologies, definitions, and concepts so that you can define the concept in a well manner in that country. That is why when I was going through the literature he has written in the book Constitutional Law, I found that he has tried to see that what certain specific terms has specific meaning in Afghanistan. Even when he is talking about, for example, the dual vice presidency, that is the outcome of the specific time period in the political state building, history of Afghanistan. As he said, that's the uniqueness of the political structure, which is imposed in a conservative way. I'm sorry, from the constitutional way, that the political structure of Afghanistan imposed the higher authority to redesign some of the well-known or some of the traditional understanding of the presidency, vice presidency, on all these things. So I believe these are the merits of the book. As a student of Afghanistan studies, as a student of conflict studies, student of ethnic studies and politics, that gives you more and more understanding of the ground realities, evidence-based situation in one of the major example, which is Afghanistan, always a fragile and broken state. Uh, the bulk of information that he has used from different corners of the country, that's so much important, because if you go many books which are written on Afghanistan, it is Kabul-based books. It's Kabul-based literature. As you think that the whole Afghanistan is Kabul. That is why the researchers, the process, the project was so much focused and centered in Kabul. And has get outside Kabul to see what are the differences, what are the uh, different aspects of Afghanistan on different other corners of the country. But Dr. Mubashir's book gives you understanding from other parts of the country, different ethnicities, different cultures, different understandings. That is why you will have a broad picture of the country, and then you can easily judge what the author says in the book, especially based on the suggestions and recommendations that he has. Aside all these things, again, Dr. Mubashir himself was saying that always researchers, students, and scholars, they have their own perspectives on the same topic. So obviously, I'm also, as a student of Afghanistan studies, will have my own perspective of the matter and the issue. When I was going through the literature, I thought to maybe emphasize here, or maybe as a question, maybe to the author, maybe he later on will respond to that. These were the ambiguity of the book which came to my mind, and I thought to share here as an observer and reviewer. So what it comes to my mind was initially the approach of the book, because when you talk about a legal approach of state nation building in a country, what I personally believe is that from the uh, preface of the book, from the introduction, bibliography of the book, it has to reflect and dance around the legal perspective or institutional perspective. Anything outside the boundaries and the chart of the legal perspective is a kind of holistic approach, which you try to justify your statement, but you are not caring so much the perspective that you have as an author in your mind. That is why sometimes when you are reading the book in different chapters, you will get out of the approach, the institutional approach. You go to different other approaches. Sometimes it is based on for example, social approach. It goes to some ethnic approach. It goes to some uh, uh, different sciences and disciplines that we have. That is why maybe sometimes, if someone is especially new in Afghanistan study, maybe he will think that aside the institutional approach, there are another approaches that we have to focus in that, uh, which is against the claim that you have in the introduction to the legal perspective. The second suggestion is the theory of the book. You have also well described that you're going to especially two parallel theories side by side to define your statement and also see the ground realities. But again, when you go to different chapters, you will find theories and modalities, especially when you're comparing Afghanistan case with many other cases outside Afghanistan. And then when you're giving examples of different other countries, those examples are based on certain other theoretical perspectives, which are not the same parameters of the comparative studies. So that is why uh, I believe that in the comparative studies, the most important and crucial thing is that you have to find the same factors of the same set. And that is important when you are justifying and you are getting a conclusion out of that, which sometimes some parts is missing, and maybe for the future publishing and for future work, you can think about it. And finally, what I believe that some parts of the book is not is out of the chart. Again, for example, what I remember in chapter 4, we are talking about the authority of the president. The authority of the president, if you look at your method, which is a cause effect, which means how the institutional law guaranteed or did not guarantee the accommodation in Afghanistan, the chapter 4 is focusing only around the power and authority of the president. It does not relate itself to the politics of ethnic accommodation, because it is all about around the despotism of the president, how the constitution of Afghanistan is delivering or guaranteeing his despotism in the country. Because as a critic, maybe someone can say that maybe the president of Afghanistan is not from the major ethnic background, maybe from the minority that you have shown in the last the chart. If he is from that background, again he can use the same despotic authority which is reflected in the Constitution of 2004. That is why I believe that it needed more and more connection between the authority of the president and how that authority rests in ethnic accommodation, or how it's an obstacle against the ethnic accommodation, that kind of relation. Uh, First of all, I believe I learned a lot out of the literature, especially from the legal perspective of nation-state building, which I'm totally, I always say with least knowledge on the basis of the legal approach. That's why I learned many things, many angles that Dr. Mubashir has written in that book. And it gave me a lot of knowledge, and I gained a lot out of the book. And I believe that's so much useful if someone is looking at the nation state building around the world. And as an exact case study for Afghanistan, I recommend all of us to go through the literature and learn from Dr. Mubashir's perspective on Afghanistan. And I'm sure that it gives a perspective for future solution of Afghanistan politics and state building. Thank you so much.
Dr. Mubashir, do you want to respond at all, or shall we go to Dr. Hopkins?
Here, Dr. Hopkins first.
Okay. All right, Dr. Hopkins, please, you have the floor.
Can I just get a thumbs up that you can hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much. First of all, Mubashir, Basha, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this celebration of your work. And thank you so much for being accommodating that I can share in this celebration without sharing the germs that my children decided to pass on to me over the last 2 days. So I really appreciate you for being so accommodating. And I echo the thanks that Dr. Balke originally said to NYU for hosting this event and for just being a part of this. In the interest of time, I'll keep my myself to 3 comments that I think really go to Bashir's work and to what a significant piece of scholarship we're here to celebrate tonight. I know you can't see the chat, Bashir, but somebody has put in the chat, Dr. Bashir Mubashir is an amazing scholar, and I can only heartily agree with that, with the evidence before us tonight. And actually, that's my first point, that of the trials and travails that have marked the history of Afghanistan over the past 25 years, there is one bright spot which Bashir is a representative of, and that is this young generation of Afghan scholars who are entering the public sphere with really weighty and important interventions that will have generational effects in defining Afghanistan and our understandings of this place for many, many years to come. So I just want to draw our attention to that, acknowledge that, and say how deeply, deeply important that is. The second point I actually want to make about the book is just in addition to everything Dr. Balke said about what a wonderful book it is, on my own bookshelf, it serves as a lovely bookend about a history of Afghan constitutionalism, which begins with Faiz Ahmed's Afghanistan Rising and now ends with Bashir Mubashir's Afghan constitutionalism. And I just think it's wonderful to see this book as part of a kind of longue durée of scholarship that seriously takes an institutional inquiry into the character of the Afghan state, but also looks over time to see its constants as well as how it changes over time. So I just want to say what a welcome addition your volume is to that question and to that history. And then the third point I'd make, which was kind of hinted to at the end of Dr. Balke's comments, is I think one of the most significant things in my mind that this book does, in addition to everything that's already been said, so I don't want to be repetitive, but I want to emphasize this point, is that you in many ways de-exceptionalize Afghanistan. And you do that really 2 ways. Number one, your conceptual approach, which fits Afghanistan in a broader literature, academic, and practitioner focused, which I think is really important and really valuable, and puts Afghanistan as a kind of normal problem, not something exceptional as it's so often talked about within policy and public circles and imagination. But you do that much more concretely as well with your comparison of Afghanistan to a number of other post-colonial states around the world. Throughout the work, you drop these hints about the comparative frame that Afghanistan inhabits with somewhat similarly situated fragile states elsewhere around the world that also face constitutional, ethnic division issues and such. Except I'm going to be slightly provocative and disagree on one of those, because in looking at your list of those places that you compare to, so you, for instance, bring up the Philippines, you bring up Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, Sri Lanka, Indonesia. One of the things that strikes me about those places as opposed to Afghanistan is they have a history of separatist movements, which Afghanistan, for all the division of Afghan society, the stakes of the Afghan political disagreement, to put it politely, have never been about the fragmentation of Afghanistan. It's always been about control of Afghanistan. And I think in many ways, this is one of the unrecognized issues of policy, but also one of the really important parts of the resiliency of an Afghan nation and an Afghan state, is this fact that the stakes are always about control of the whole rather than centrifugal forces breaking it apart. If we look at many other states in the world, they're much more likely, even states in the neighborhood, to fragment well before Afghanistan. And with that in mind, my question to you then is this, provocatively put, which is that you focus very much on ethnic accommodation, types of ethnic balance, institutionalizing some sort of ethnic recipe to ensure the stability of Afghanistan. And I wonder if we tend to emphasize the ethnic divide within Afghanistan. And actually, I'll go back to something that you mentioned, which is characterizing Afghanistan as a divided society as opposed to a fragmented society. And I thought that was, both in the book and also in your presentation, a really insightful and thoughtful observation that would be easily missed. But I just ask you to expand on that. I'll cede my time to the audience, who I know have much more intelligent and penetrating questions to ask, but I just would, once again, congratulations to a job well done. I look forward to assigning this to many of my students for years to come, and also to recommending it to all my friends. So congratulations, Bashar.
Thank you. Okay. All right, so I'd rather stay on the positive points and ignore the questions and comments. But no, okay. So I'm gonna start with the suggestions. Well, thank you so much for your kind words, Dr. Balhi and Dr. Benjamin. I am flattered to hear very nice words about my work. So to talk about a number of points you brought up, one was the approach of why it's not just legal, why it's like I'm trying to engage multiple disciplines. This was the thing that I did since I started my PhD. I was trying to have a multidisciplinary approach rather than only a legal approach. And in fact, this book is based on my dissertation. And when I started writing my dissertation, I figured that legal analysis can only give you one angle of things. And therefore, it was better to more kind of, if you want to have a more comprehensive understanding of what the problem is, you may want to take a look at it from law perspective, from political science perspective, and from sociology perspective. And one interesting thing about my PhD committee or dissertation committee was that they included professors from all different disciplinary backgrounds. One was from public policy, one was from law, one was from political science and sociology. And in fact, I had two co-chairs. One was law and one was political science. And that's kind of unique. And I wanted to have that because I wanted to have a more kind of holistic understanding of the problem and trying to figure out the solutions to those problems. But I understand the challenge as well, because if you try to do everything, you may just miss a lot of things along the way. And probably that's what it is that I have to work on in my future research projects. But from the beginning, my intention, legal perspective, it was already, I've decided to have sociological approach to it as well and political science approach to it, which was sometimes difficult because you had to reconcile with your different advisors from different departments because they all have like different unique methodological approach, and they want you to follow those approaches as well. So I had to struggle with that, but I made it happen with dissertation, and I tried to make it happen with the book as well. And for the theory and the case studies, I followed two methodologies. One is process tracing. So I wanted to basically decipher all the institutions and decipher ethnic accommodation and try to find the link between all these institutions and ethnic accommodations, which is what one of the slides tried to show. And the second approach I tried to apply was a single outcome case study. So it's sort of comparative studies, but with a focus only on one case rather than all the cases. So I tried to compare institutional designs between Afghanistan and 9 other countries, but the focus was really on ethnic accommodation in Afghanistan. And what I was trying to flesh out in those comparative studies was to see what are some alternative options that different other countries have considered that Afghans have not considered, but could have considered or may consider in the future, given the context of Afghanistan as a very important factor. And also with each chapter, what I wanted to do was, because my approach was, or my understanding of institutions was, that each institution has some positive influences on ethnic accommodation, but they also had some uh, as well. So I want to, highlight both the um, the sub-institutions that have had more kind of positive impact on the accommodation, and usually my chapters start with that, and then I would problematize the other aspects of those same institutions that would have a negative impact. So, for example, SNTV, which I said was basically an abomination to elections of any kind. One really good aspect of it was proportional representation. It did promote fair representations of all ethnic groups, but then they had a very problematic feature, which was basically discourage and fragment any kind of coalitions and political parties. So, and that probably, maybe contributed to maybe to some confusions as to, to how the theory was established by each chapter. On the issue of power of the presidents, yeah, so my intention was to first try to explain what are the constitutional authorities of the presidents. And here I wanted to look at a number of things. The things that the Constitution deferred to future laws, and usually the constitutions do. And the things that the Constitution tried to um, provide a clause or a provision, but the terms of the constitutions or the clauses were so ambiguous that the presidents basically used those loopholes in their favor and interpreted the Constitution as if they had those powers. And the third aspect of the Constitution was the part where the Constitution just made, or the framers made the wrong choice in terms of who gets what. One of the things I mentioned in the Constitution was the rule reversal. Because in the presidential system, you usually think that the president does the executive thing, appointing, and making all those executive decisions. And the parliament is supposed to do the legislative stuff. But the way the Constitution designed the checks and balances and the separation of power, it was mostly the president who would make law, and it was mostly the parliament who would go after the ministers, question them and impeach them and disarm them and things like that. So the rules were reversed, where the parliament was doing mostly kind of the executive thing, and the president was doing more kind of the legislative stuff. On the issue of overemphasis on ethnic divide, yeah. So I had, and I still have this continuous debate with Dr. Shamshad Saleh on whether we should consider Afghanistan a divided society or a plural society. And I did the survey about this topic as well. Eventually, I think I just used the term interchangeably, divided and plural. But there is a small distinction between the two. Divided mostly means that, different groups have different demands and wants, and they're more kind of in disputed and conflict situation. Where plural just states that there are multiple ethnic groups and, leaves the rest to more kind of analysis of the author within the book. But I try to use both interchangeably. Maybe in the future I should stay stuck with one or the other. I think I have to say is, and this is the thing I mentioned in my second chapter when I was talking about the failed nation or the failed constitution, is the public's attitude towards the nation changes over time, and it depends on the circumstances. Under the right circumstances, they feel more kind of patriotic, they feel more kind of solidarity. But under a difficult circumstance like the one we experienced after the Taliban, and especially with the social media we have, and you can anonymously go and write something, something negative about different ethnic groups, that would actually encourage more kind of division between different groups, and that's what we are experiencing in Afghanistan. Generally, I think Afghan communities, I'm not talking about the elites, and by elites, I mean both the intellectual as well as the political elites. I'm talking about the mass level population. They tend to be more kind of centripetal, but the circumstances not right in that sense. In a sense that right now everyone is frustrated, and you hear more kind of divisive statements and phrases and terminologies in Afghanistan that you would never hear before. Because in Afghanistan, it's sort of a taboo to talk about even ethnicity when you're talking with people from different ethnic groups. But it seems it's no longer the case, and the division is increasing. And I hope that stops somewhere and we can bend more kind of towards solidarity.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks so much to the discussants and to Dr. Mobasher. I'm conscious that we are a little bit over time, but I also want to give the audience a chance to ask questions. And if there are also questions in the chat, we can maybe answer, pose a few to Dr. Mobasher. Have the mic. If there are any questions, maybe we can do one round of questions. Anybody would like to ask something of our speaker? Great, yeah.
Hi, I'm Olivier Therian. I am a first year and I'm studying international relations. Thank you for the three presenters. You guys were incredible. I learned a lot. And I was just wondering, Dr. Mubashir, you mentioned twice the president uses loopholes to go over parliament. What is like an example of that that would be specific to Afghanistan that's like difficult for them to, I guess, like difficult for them to overcome?
Yeah, so there were a lot of examples. So I'm going to give you one example. A constitutional provision suggests that a president can issue a legislative decrees when the parliament is in recess and when it is necessary for the president to issue the decree. And then what presidents would usually do was just wait for the parliament. Whenever they thought that the parliament was not going to approve their laws or whatever they have drafted, they would just wait for the parliament to go in recess, and then they would issue like hundreds of legislative decrees because they decided that it was necessary. And in fact, if you look at 6 election laws, and election laws are like the most important laws, and they would actually shape, the parliament and how the parliament would function. All of them were adopted through presidential decrees rather than approval of the parliament. And one way the president actually did make the parliament dysfunctional was through these legislative decrees deciding what the elections had to be.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'm Ashley. I work at a local nonprofit. My question is more along the lines of methodology, specifically, sort of how you take social contract theory, right? Something that came out of the Western Enlightenment, and sort of the relationship that it has to a Middle Eastern nation, right? And sort of that these are sort of a methodology that comes from a different sort of intellectual and religious background than the country that you're discussing. I'd love to hear more about sort of your approach to that. I don't want to call it conflict, but like the relationship between those two things.
Yeah, should we take another question or two? That's a good idea. We can get them all at once. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Jahid from CNAS, a think tank. I have a question for you, Dr. Mubashir, about the level of participation of the people of Afghanistan in 2004, which was around 12.6 million people. In 2019, we had around 9 million, but the vote in 2004 it was 9 million. In 2019 it was 6.3 million people who voted. What do you think about the failure of the nation or the failure of the constitution? Why, instead of increasing the level of voters, we had the decrease of voters? What was the main reason in your perspective? Thanks.
Maybe we can take one more question perhaps from the chat if I saw some scrolling past, there was maybe a question or two. Dr. Hopkins, if there's any that you might pose. If not, we could take another one from our live audience, our in-person audience, I should say.
There is one from the chat, which is, what are the top 5 past mistakes that should be avoided when designing a constitution in Afghanistan post-Taliban era? Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Thanks for that. Okay, Dr. Mubashir, thanks.
All right, so thank you, Ashley, for the question about the social contract. I did not necessarily discuss the issue of social contract in the book, but my second chapter was basically about it started with a statement by President Joe Biden. Afghanistan was never going to be built. It's not a nation, it's just 3 countries, and the neighboring countries want different part of it, and people don't get along. And so no matter what you do, it just doesn't work. And I start with that. And I did some survey, and I also interviewed some of the political elites of Afghanistan. And I wanted to know if that was the case. But actually, I did those surveys before that, but then I figured, well, this is a response to this. My argument was that people were ready for a democratic society. There was a survey done by World Bank, and they did a survey since 2001 until 2021. So every year they were doing the survey, and they surveyed around 1,040,000 people or something like that. Okay, don't cite me on this. Look at my books. I wrote it somewhere. So, but there was a lot of people that they surveyed, and generally there was no point in time during the 20 years where people disfavored democracy and wanted something else. And I looked at the government wasn't popular. President Ghani wasn't popular for sure, but people still wanted election. And there was one other point that I actually looked at as well, and there was another scholar, Anna Larson, and she's a prominent scholar. She has written a lot of articles about Afghanistan as well. One interesting thing she found was that even some of the people who would say they don't like democracy, they would say we want election. So for them, democracy be something other than election. But when you ask the very same people, how about representation and election, they say, no, we want those things. We just don't want democracy, because for them, democracy seems more kind of a Western legal culture and religious influence over Afghanistan, whereas election is something else where people have to choose their representatives. So that's one thing I looked at. The other thing I looked at, and I noted in the book as well, was the popularity of the opposition groups, which initially was like all opposition groups, including, you know, the traditionally what's called the warlords, and then eventually the survey was about the popularity of the Taliban. And if you look at through those 20 years, the popularity of the Taliban actually decreased rather than increased among the people. So, and then I asked them, for example, what do you think about the nation, right? Do you think Afghanistan is a nation? So I asked a question along those same lines. Do you think Afghanistan is a nation, or you think it's just multiple nations and it's divided nations, or a nation with some? So I gave them multiple options. Eventually, the popular response I got was, yes, we are a nation, but we have ethnic tensions. So it was basically reflecting what was going on in Afghanistan, instead of suggesting that, you know, we are not a nation, we are divided, or something along those lines, and something that Dr. Hopkins also mentioned about. So I figured that actually there's a lot of different ethnic groups, despite their differences, they share with each other. They want sort of inclusive, but inclusive may mean different things to different people. They think they have a nation. They may disagree about the name of the nation. They may say, well, we are Afghanistan. So I would say, we are not Afghanistan. Some would say, we are Afghans. I would say, I'm not an Afghan. Disagree what the name must be for the nation, but they do not disagree with their imagination of what a nation is in that country. So I figured that they shared a lot, and that does constitute some form of social contract, which could be the base of a proper constitutional design for Afghanistan. And the answer to your question, Jayed, thank you very much. It was also a great question. The elections became less popular in terms of attendance, not in terms of people didn't want the election, but because election after election, there was a lot of fraudulence going on. And after the 2014 election, which we had around, I don't remember exactly. In 2019, we had 1.8 million people attending the election. And that was like the lowest rate of participation, perhaps in any country in the world. Um, it was because most people decided that it's going to be rigged. and there's going to be some fraudulent. And that's why a lot of people did not attend. And most importantly, we didn't have any new charismatic, energetic candidates. It was like the same people. We had Abdullah, we had Ghani, and then we had a bunch of other people who nobody knew. So I guess for those two reasons, not a lot of people participated. But again, if you look at the survey published, the attitude toward democracy or election wasn't low at all. But you could see like the drop of public, the drop of popularity of democracy during the election times because of the rigged elections. But at no point in time it was like below 50%. And I guess the last question. Okay, so the last question: top 5 mistakes. Okay, I'm going to talk about one mistake, perhaps, or two mistakes. One was the issue of lack of public consultation on the Constitution. So when the Constitution was ratified or when it was created, initially the thought was we have to share with the public and get public's opinion with regard to the Constitution and then incorporate those opinions into the Constitution and then ratify it. But it didn't happen. What happened was basically, and instead of sharing the draft of the Constitution, they shared a bunch of questions to people, a survey sort of questions. And they didn't get a lot of replies. And we don't know if those replies were actually incorporated into the Constitution. So there was a lack of public consultation. The society was given like 2 months to basically respond to those questions. And when the Constitution was ratified, again, it was very symbolic in the sense that people who were participants of the constitutional jirga or constitutional council did not vote on article by article basis. They did not even vote on the entire document as a constitution. It was just people were pushed to stand up and clap for the constitution as if it was ratified. And one reason for that was the United Nations delegation and the United States delegation, Zalmay Khalilzad, who forced the council to ratify the Constitution as soon as possible because they didn't have funds for it if they continue. So they said, this is the number of days you got. You have to just sign the Constitution and that's it. Otherwise, we can have funds and you're not going to have Constitution if you continue it forever. And once they said it, then the Constitution was ratified. And even after the ratification of the Constitution, around 42 changes were brought to the Constitution that were not just word changes, it was really substantive changes to the terms of the Constitution, most of which actually led to more ethnic divisions, including, for example, the clause about the languages of Afghanistan, the national terminologies and things like that. The anthem, which eventually led to more division among ethnic groups. Yeah, thanks. So that's one change. I guess I'm going to go with that.
Okay, well, thank you so much again. Thanks to everyone for attending. Thanks to NYU for hosting this event. And many, many congratulations to Dr. Mobashir on the publication of this fantastic work. Thanks to the discussants as well for being with us. And it was a pleasure. Thanks.